The courtroom was quiet, too quiet. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the heavy, tense kind that comes right before something big happens. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching dust floating in the air like tiny sparks. Lawyers shuffled papers. Reporters in the back row leaned forward, pens ready. Even the bailiff stood a little straighter. Then the doors at the back swung open. He walked in like he owned the place, and in a way he kind of did. Billionaire, tech mogul. The kind of man whose face was on magazine covers and whose name popped up in headlines every other week. He wore a custom suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, and his shoes gleamed like they'd never touched a sidewalk. Behind him trailed a team of lawyers in matching dark suits, all walking fast to keep up. He didn't look around, didn't nod to anyone. Just strode down the center aisle like he was late for something more important, even though this hearing had been scheduled for weeks. He slid into his seat at the defendant's table without a word, crossing his arms over his chest like he was already bored. A few people exchanged glances. One of the junior attorneys from the plaintiff's side whispered something to her colleague, who just shook his head with a tight smile. Everyone knew who he was, and everyone knew his reputation. Brilliant, ruthless, and convinced the rules didn't apply to him. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs about fair wages and worker rights. Inside, the air felt thick with expectation. Then the bailiff's voice cut through the stillness. "All rise." The words echoed off the marble floors and high ceilings. Every person in the room stood. Lawyers, clerks, reporters, even the security guards near the door. Everyone except one. He stayed seated. Not because he didn't hear, not because he was confused. He just didn't move. His arms stayed crossed. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, not even glancing toward the bench. A faint smirk played at the corner of his mouth like this was all some private joke only he understood. A low murmur rippled through the room. Someone coughed. Another lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The bailiff cleared his throat and repeated, "All rise," a little louder this time, still. The billionaire didn't budge. Then the door behind the bench opened. Judge Alicia Freeman stepped into the courtroom. She wasn't flashy. No dramatic robe flourishes or booming voice. She walked with calm purpose, her black judicial robe falling neatly around her, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a simple bun. But the moment she appeared, the room seemed to settle, not out of fear, but out of respect. She was known for being fair, sharp, and utterly unshaken by power. Before becoming a federal judge, she'd worked as a public defender, then a civil rights attorney. She'd argued cases in front of the Supreme Court. She'd grown up in a neighborhood where people worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, and she never forgot it. Now she presided over one of the busiest federal courts in the country, and lawyers on both sides knew. In her courtroom, money didn't talk. The law did. As she moved toward the bench, every eye followed her, except one. The billionaire remained seated, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable, but clearly defiant. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't accidental. It was a statement. And everyone in that room understood it. A few reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. One of the plaintiff's lawyers, an older woman with kind eyes and tired shoulders, glanced at the judge, then at the billionaire, her jaw tightening. She'd spent months preparing this case, a lawsuit against his company for underpaying hundreds of contract workers, denying them benefits, and firing anyone who complained. She knew how hard those workers had fought just to be heard, and now in this moment their dignity felt like it was on the line too. Judge Freeman reached the bench. She didn't look down at the man who refused to stand. She didn't scowl or pause. She simply turned, adjusted her glasses, and said in a calm, clear voice, "Be seated." The room sat, but the tension didn't ease. If anything, it thickened. The judge opened the case file in front of her. Her fingers moved slowly over the pages, but her eyes stayed steady. She knew exactly what had just happened. She'd seen disrespect before, sometimes from angry defendants, sometimes from entitled executives. But this felt different. This wasn't just rudeness. It felt personal, like he was testing her, seeing if she'd flinch. She wouldn't. "Counsel," she began, her voice smooth but firm. "We're here today on the matter of Henderson v. Nixora Technologies. Plaintiff alleges systematic wage theft, misclassification of employees, and retaliation against whistleblowers. Is that correct?" The lead attorney for the workers stood. Yes, Your Honor. And the defense? She asked, finally glancing toward the billionaire's table. His lead lawyer stood quickly, smoothing his tie. Your Honor, we deny all allegations. Our client maintains that all employment practices were fully compliant with state and federal law. The judge nodded slowly. Very well. Let's proceed. But before the lawyer could say more, she added almost casually, Mr. Thorne, would you please rise when addressing the court? All eyes snapped to the billionaire. He didn't move. A beat of silence passed. Then another. Finally, he uncrossed his arms and stood, but slowly, deliberately, like he was doing her a favor. He didn't look at her, just stared straight ahead, jaw set. Thank you, the judge said, her tone unchanged, no anger, no satisfaction, just acknowledgement. He sat back down immediately. The hearing began. But no one could focus on the legal arguments, not yet. The unspoken question hung in the air like smoke. What just happened? And what will she do about it? Back in the gallery, a young law student who'd waited 3 hours for a seat scribbled in her notebook. He thought his money made him untouchable. He forgot where he was. Outside, the protest chants grew louder. Respect the work. Respect the workers. Inside, the judge turned a page in the file. Her expression gave nothing away. But those who knew her, her longtime clerk, the court reporter who'd worked with her for a decade, saw the slight tightening around her eyes. Not rage, not hurt, something quieter, sharper. Resolve. This wasn't just about courtroom etiquette. It was about who gets to be respected in a place that's supposed to treat everyone equally. It was about whether power could walk in and rewrite the rules just by showing up. And as the billionaire leaned back in his chair, looking smug, he had no idea what was coming, because Judge Freeman wasn't the type to make a scene. She was the type to make history, with a gavel, a ruling, and unwavering quiet strength. The morning wore on. Lawyers argued. Documents were submitted. But every time the billionaire spoke, he did so while seated, as if daring her to say something. Each time she addressed him politely, professionally, never rising to the bait. Yet the room could feel it. Something was building. Like a storm gathering far off the horizon. You couldn't see it yet, but you could feel the air changing. By the time the lunch recess was called, the courthouse buzzed with whispers. Reporters called their editors. Interns ran to grab coffee for their bosses, eyes wide with excitement. Even the security guards exchanged knowing looks, because everyone sensed it. This wasn't going to end quietly. And the man who thought he could walk into a courtroom and show no respect to the judge? He had just made the biggest mistake of his very privileged life. But Judge Freeman? She hadn't even begun to show what she was capable of. She simply closed her file, stood, and walked out the side door. Head high, shoulders straight, dignity intact. The billionaire watched her go. And for the first time that day, the smirk faded from his face. The moment the judge stepped out of the courtroom, the air changed. It was like someone had opened a window after a long, stuffy meeting. Everyone let out a breath they didn't know they were holding. Lawyers started talking in low voices. Reporters tapped furiously on their phones. And the billionaire's legal team huddled close, whispering urgently. He sat back in his chair, arms crossed again, looking more annoyed than concerned. Like he'd just been asked to wait in line at a coffee shop he thought was beneath him. But in the judge's private chambers down the hall, it was quiet. Not tense, not angry, just calm. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft stripes across the wooden desk. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled not with trophies or fancy awards, but with well-worn law books, photos of her family, and a small framed quote that read, "Justice is what love looks like in public." She sat at her desk, sipping black coffee from a plain white mug. Her clerk, a young woman who'd clerked for 3 judges before this one and knew real integrity when she saw it, stood by the door, arms crossed, eyes blazing. "He didn't just disrespect you," the clerk said, voice low but sharp. "He disrespected the whole court. The system. The people who worked their fingers to the bone just to get a hearing in front of you." The judge set her mug down gently. "I know." "Then why didn't you hold him in contempt right then? You could have. You should have." A small, tired smile touched the judge's lips. "Because contempt would have made it about me. And this case isn't about me." She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. "It's about the janitor who worked 12-hour shifts cleaning his offices for less than minimum wage. It's about the delivery driver who got fired after asking for overtime. It's about the single mom who couldn't afford her kid's asthma medicine because his company called her an independent contractor, but treated her like a robot. The clerk was silent for a moment. She'd read every deposition, every email, every payroll record. She'd seen the human cost behind the legal jargon. But he's sending a message, she said quietly. He thinks he's above this place. He's not, the judge said simply. No one is. Not even billionaires. She opened the case file again, flipping to a section near the back. Look at this, she said, pointing to a highlighted email chain. His head of operations wrote to HR, if they complain, cut their hours. They'll get the message. And they did. Over and over, her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The words carried their own weight. I don't need to yell at him to show he's wrong, she continued. I just need to make sure the truth is louder than his money. Outside, the lunch break stretched on. In the courthouse cafeteria, the billionaire's team debated strategy over salads and bottled water. One of his lawyers suggested they apologize. Just a quick, polite nod to decorum to smooth things over. But the billionaire waved him off. She's not going to do anything, he said, swirling his iced tea like it was fine wine. Judges don't mess with people like me. They need campaign donations. They need connections. They know how the world works. His lead counsel didn't look convinced, but he stayed quiet. He'd been in enough courtrooms to know that some judges played the long game. Back in chambers, the judge wasn't thinking about power plays or public image. She was thinking about fairness, about balance, about how the law at its best could be a tool to lift people up, not just protect the powerful. She'd grown up watching her mother work double shifts at a hospital, coming home with aching feet and tired eyes but never missing a day. She remembered the way her mother would say, "Honey, the system only works if good people stand in it." That's why she became a lawyer, not for fame, not for glory, but because someone had to stand in the gap for those who couldn't afford to. Now, decades later, she was that someone. Her clerk handed her a fresh stack of exhibits, time logs, pay stubs, voice recordings from worker interviews. One woman described crying in her car after being told she'd be replaced if she filed a complaint. Another talked about skipping meals so her kids could eat. The judge read each one slowly. She didn't rush. She never did, because behind every page was a real person with real pain. When the recess ended, she walked back into the courtroom the same way she'd left. Calm, composed, focused. No dramatic pause, no glare. Just a woman doing her job. The bailiff called, "All rise." This time, the billionaire stood. Not quickly, not respectfully, but he stood. Maybe it was pressure from his lawyers. Maybe he realized the optics were bad. Or maybe, just maybe, he sensed something in the air he couldn't quite name. The judge took her seat. "Proceed," she said. The afternoon session began with the defense trying to argue that the workers weren't technically employees, so wage laws didn't apply. It was a common tactic: relabel people, strip them of rights, call it innovation, but the judge wasn't having it. "Counsel," she interrupted gently, "are you suggesting that someone who works 60 hours a week, follows your client's schedule, wears your client's uniform, and uses your client's equipment, isn't an employee?" The lawyer stammered. "Your Honor, the classification is based on what?" she asked, not unkindly. "Based on a label your client slaps on a contract to avoid responsibility? Because I've read those contracts." Page 12, paragraph 4. Worker agrees to comply with all company policies, schedules, and performance metrics. That sounds like employment to me. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the court reporter paused for a second as if to make sure she'd heard right. The lawyer sat down, flustered. Then the judge turned to the billionaire. "Do you personally review these worker agreements?" He shifted in his seat. "I have a team for that. So you don't know what's in them?" "I trust my team." "Interesting," she said, her tone still even. "Because your team signed contracts that deny basic protections to people who keep your business running. People who, by the way, can't afford to trust anyone when their rent is due." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading through every corner of the room. One of the plaintiffs, sitting in the front row, a woman in a faded blue sweater who'd cleaned offices in his buildings for 5 years, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The rest of the afternoon unfolded, like a slow unraveling. Every argument the defense made, the judge met with a quiet, precise question that exposed the flaw beneath it. She didn't grandstand, she didn't lecture, she just revealed the truth piece by piece like peeling an onion. By the time court adjourned for the day, the Billionaire's team looked shaken. Reporters rushed to file their stories. And the workers? They walked out with their heads a little higher. That evening, the judge stayed late, not to prepare more arguments, but to write a note. Just a short one on plain courthouse stationery. She slipped it into an envelope and asked her clerk to hand it to the woman in the blue sweater before she left. It read, "Thank you for your courage. Justice begins with voices like yours." She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. Back at his penthouse, the billionaire scrolled through news alerts on his phone. Headlines like "Judge shuts down billionaire's legal maneuvers" and "Courtroom clash over worker rights" filled his screen. He frowned, tossed the phone on the couch, and poured himself a drink. He still didn't get it. He thought this was about winning, about ego, about who had the last word. But the judge knew better. This was never about him. It was about the quiet dignity of people who show up, day after day, doing honest work, and deserve to be treated like human beings. And as she turned off the lights in her chambers and walked out into the cool evening air, she felt no anger. No triumph, just resolve, because tomorrow, the hearing would continue and she would be ready. The third day of the hearing began like any other. Gray morning light, the hum of the city waking up outside, the soft clatter of coffee cups in the courthouse hallway. But inside Courtroom 7, the air felt different, tighter, like everyone knew something was about to shift. The billionaire arrived earlier than usual, flanked by two new lawyers this time, older, more polished, the kind who wore cufflinks and spoke in smooth, practiced tones. They'd clearly been brought in to steady the ship. He didn't smirk this time, didn't lounge in his chair like he owned the room. He sat upright, eyes forward, but there was a stiffness in his shoulders, a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there before. He'd seen the news, read the headlines, heard the whispers, and for the first time he wasn't sure he was in control. Across the aisle, the plaintiff's legal team exchanged quiet nods. They'd spent the night reviewing every note, every transcript, every piece of evidence. They knew today could be the turning point. The bailiff called, "All rise." Everyone stood, including the billionaire. No hesitation, no show of defiance. Just a man doing what he was told, though his expression said he still didn't believe it mattered. Judge Freeman entered, calm as ever. She nodded to the room, took her seat, and opened the file without fanfare. "Before we continue," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I'd like to address a matter of courtroom conduct." A hush fell over the room. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick slower. "Federal courtrooms operate on a foundation of mutual respect," she began. "Not because it's tradition, but because respect is the bedrock of justice. When someone refuses to stand as the court enters, it's not just a breach of etiquette. It signals a belief that the rules don't apply equally, that some people are above the process." She paused, not for effect, but to let the words settle. "I understand that wealth, influence, and public status can create an illusion of exception," she continued. "But in this room there are no exceptions. Only citizens before the law." She looked directly at the billionaire, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a quiet clarity that made him shift in his seat. "Your refusal to rise yesterday was noted. Not for punishment, but for correction. Because if we allow disrespect to go unchallenged, we chip away at the very idea that justice is blind." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room was so quiet you could hear someone's pen click in the back row. Then, just as smoothly as she'd begun, she turned the page in her file. "Now let's return to the motion regarding discovery." But something had changed. The billionaire didn't lean back, didn't cross his arms. He sat forward slightly, hands resting on the table, eyes fixed on the judge like he was seeing her for the first time, not as an obstacle, but as a force. The morning session focused on internal company emails, hundreds of them, many of which had been withheld until a court order forced their release. One email chain showed executives discussing how to restructure worker roles to avoid paying overtime. Another showed a manager writing, "If they push back, tell them there are 10 others waiting to take their spot." The judge listened carefully as the plaintiff's attorney read excerpts aloud. Her expression never changed. but her pen moved steadily across her notepad. Then, during a break in testimony, she did something unexpected. "Counsel," she said, turning to the defense, "your client's deposition states he was unaware of these practices. Is that still your position?" The lead defense attorney stood. "Yes, Your Honor. My client delegated operational decisions to his management team." "I see," the judge said. "Then perhaps we should hear from that management team." She turned to the clerk. "Issue subpoenas for the CEO of Human Resources, the head of operations, and the chief compliance officer. I want them here by Thursday." A ripple went through the room. Subpoenas meant sworn testimony. Under oath. No more hiding behind "I didn't know." The billionaire's face went pale. He glanced at his lawyers, who suddenly looked far less confident. After the recess, the judge called a short break. In the hallway, one of the plaintiffs, a man who'd driven delivery vans for the company for 7 years, stood near a window, staring out at the street. His hands were rough, his jacket worn at the elbows. A young reporter approached him gently. "Do you think she'll make it right?" the reporter asked. The man didn't look at her. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But for the first time in a long time, I feel like someone's actually listening." Back in the courtroom, the afternoon session began with the judge addressing a procedural motion from the defense, one asking to dismiss part of the case based on a technicality. She listened patiently as the lawyer argued his point, citing case law and precedent. When he finished, she didn't interrupt. She just sat for a moment, fingers steepled, eyes thoughtful. Then she spoke. "You're correct that procedural rules matter," she said. "But procedure should serve justice, not block it. If we dismiss claims simply because a form was filed 2 days late, while ignoring that hundreds of people were denied fair pay for years, then we've turned the law into a game, and the only winners are those who can afford the best players." Her words weren't fiery. They were measured. But they cut deep. She denied the motion. The defense team exchanged worried glances. Their strategy was crumbling, not with a bang, but with quiet, relentless logic. Later that day, during another break, the judge stepped into her chambers. Her clerk handed her a fresh cup of tea. "You're not going to hold him in contempt, are you?" the clerk asked. The judge shook her head. "Contempt is a hammer. Sometimes you need a scalpel." She opened a drawer and pulled out a thick binder labeled Nixora Worker Testimonies, Confidential. Inside were handwritten notes from interviews with over 200 employees. Stories of skipped meals, unpaid overtime, fear of speaking up. "I don't need to punish him to win," she said softly. "I just need to make sure the truth can't be ignored." When court resumed, the judge called for a key piece of evidence, a recording from a company town hall meeting, previously sealed. In it, the billionaire himself could be heard saying, "We're not in the business of charity. If you want benefits, go work somewhere else." The room went still. His lawyers jumped up, objecting, calling it out of context, but the judge overruled them. "The plaintiff has authenticated the recording," she said, "and context is exactly what we're here to examine." As the audio played, the billionaire stared at the floor. For the first time, he looked small. Not powerless, just human, flawed, exposed. When it ended, the judge didn't gloat. She simply said, "Let the record reflect that the defendant's own words confirm a pattern of disregard for worker protections." Then she turned to the plaintiff's table. "Do you have anything further for today?" The lead attorney stood. "Just this, Your Honor." She handed up a new exhibit, a petition signed by 312 current and former workers, asking the court to ensure their voices were heard. The judge took it, read the first few lines, then set it down gently on her bench. "Noted," she said, "and honored." As the day ended, people lingered in the hallway. Not to gossip, but to talk, plaintiffs, lawyers, even a few curious law students. There was a sense of something shifting, something real. That night, the billionaire didn't go to his penthouse. He sat alone in his office, staring at the city lights. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about stock prices or headlines. He was thinking about the man in the worn jacket, the woman in the blue sweater, the voices on that recording, and the judge, calm, unshakable, seeing through every layer of power he'd built around himself. He still didn't fully understand, but he was starting to, because the courtroom hadn't shocked him with anger or punishment. It had shocked him with truth. And truth, he was learning, doesn't shout, it just stands there, quiet, clear, and impossible to ignore. The fourth day in the courtroom felt different from the start, not because of drama but because something had settled. The billionaire walked in without his usual entourage. Just one lawyer this time, and he carried his own briefcase. He didn't look around, didn't smirk. He sat down quietly, like someone who'd finally realized he wasn't the main character in this story. Outside, the protest had grown. More signs, more voices. But inside it was calm, focused, like everyone knew they were nearing the end of something important. Judge Freeman entered right on time. No delay, no fanfare. She nodded to the room, took her seat, and opened the file like it was any other case. But everyone knew it wasn't. Before we proceed, she said, I've reviewed all submitted evidence, testimony, and legal arguments in this matter. I've also considered the public interest, the rights of the workers involved, and the obligations of the defendant under federal labor law. She paused, not for effect, but to gather her thoughts. Her voice stayed even, but there was a weight behind it now, like she was carrying the hopes of hundreds on her shoulders, and she wouldn't let them down. Over the past 3 days, she continued, this court has heard consistent, credible testimony from workers who were misclassified, underpaid, and retaliated against for speaking up. We've seen internal emails, payroll records, and recorded statements that confirm a pattern, not of isolated mistakes, but of deliberate policy. She looked toward the defense table. The billionaire kept his eyes down. Your client, she said gently but firmly, built a company on innovation, but innovation should never come at the cost of human dignity. Then she began to read her ruling. It wasn't long. She didn't need pages of legalese. She spoke in plain words so clear even someone with no law degree could understand. First, she ruled that all 312 workers named in the suit were, in fact, employees, not independent contractors. That meant they were entitled to back wages, overtime pay, and benefits they'd been denied for years. She ordered the company to calculate what was owed within 30 days under court supervision. Second, she mandated sweeping changes to the company's hiring and payroll practices. No more blanket misclassification. No more threats to workers who asked questions. An independent monitor, approved by the court, would oversee compliance for the next 2 years. Third, she denied the defense's motion to limit damages. When harm is systemic, she said, remedy must be too. The courtroom stayed silent, not out of shock but out of respect. This wasn't revenge. It was repair. Then came the part no one expected. In addition, the judge said, I'm imposing a condition not typically seen in civil cases, but one I believe is necessary here. She looked directly at the billionaire. You will complete 40 hours of community service, to be performed at a local workforce development center, not as punishment but as understanding. You'll work alongside people who face the same barriers your company's policies created. You'll listen. You'll learn. And you'll report back to this court on what you've seen. A soft gasp went through the room, not because it was harsh, but because it was human. His lawyer started to object, but the judge held up a hand. This isn't optional, she said. It's part of the settlement. If you refuse, the court will consider it a failure to comply, and that opens the door to further penalties. The billionaire didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, like he finally understood this wasn't a game he could buy his way out of. When she finished, she closed the file. The court finds in favor of the plaintiffs on all major claims, she said. Justice isn't just about money. It's about making sure the same harm doesn't happen again. And sometimes, that means the person at the top has to step down from their pedestal and stand on the same ground as everyone else. Then she turned to the plaintiff's table. To the workers who came forward, thank you. You didn't just fight for yourselves. You fought for every person who's ever been told their labor doesn't matter. That takes courage. And this ruling is yours. One of the women in the front row, the one in the blue sweater, started to cry quietly. Her friend put an arm around her. After court adjourned, people didn't rush out. They lingered, hugged, whispered words of relief. A few reporters approached the plaintiffs, but gently, respectfully. No shouting, no sensationalism, just real people sharing real stories. Down the hall in a quiet corner near the elevators, the billionaire stood alone for a long moment. His lawyer hovered nearby but didn't speak. For the first time in years, maybe ever, he looked unsure of what to do next. Then he saw her. The woman in the blue sweater was walking toward the exit, holding hands with another plaintiff, a younger man who'd been fired after asking for a lunch break. They were laughing softly, tears still on their cheeks, but their shoulders were lighter. He almost walked over, almost said something, but he stopped himself. What could he possibly say that wouldn't sound empty? Instead, he turned and walked the other way, head down, hands in his pockets. That afternoon, news of the ruling spread fast. Not because it was flashy, but because it felt rare, like a moment when the system actually worked the way it was supposed to. Legal blogs called it a masterclass in judicial restraint and moral clarity. Worker advocacy groups shared the judge's words online. Even some business leaders admitted the company's practices had gone too far. But the judge didn't give interviews, didn't pose for photos. She went back to her chambers, changed out of her robe, and reviewed the next day's docket. A quiet case about a small landlord dispute. To her, this was just another day of work, another step toward fairness. Later that evening, at the Workforce Development Center downtown, the director got a call from the court clerk. She listened, took notes, and hung up with a small smile. 40 hours. Starting next Monday. She didn't know who he was, not really. Just another person ordered to serve. But she'd make sure he saw the real faces behind the headlines. The single dad learning computer skills at night after his warehouse shift. The immigrant woman studying for her GED. The teenager trying to get his first job after aging out of foster care. Maybe, just maybe, he'd finally understand what his company had broken and what it would take to fix it. Back at the courthouse, the janitor who'd cleaned Courtroom 7 for 20 years paused outside the judge's door. He'd heard about the ruling. He'd seen the workers leave with hope in their eyes. He didn't knock, didn't say anything. He just stood there for a moment, then went back to his cart, pushing it down the hall with a little more pride than usual. Because today, justice hadn't just been written in a ruling, it had been lived, and that made all the difference. Weeks passed. The headlines faded. The protest signs disappeared from the courthouse steps. Life moved on, for most people. But for a few, everything had changed. The billionaire showed up at the Workforce Development Center on a rainy Monday morning, right on time. He wore a plain jacket, no logo, no designer tags, no entourage, just him and a court order in his back pocket. The center's director, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense walk, greeted him at the door. "You'll be helping with the job readiness workshop," she said, handing him a clipboard. "Set up chairs. Pass out materials. Listen more than you talk," he nodded. Didn't argue. Didn't ask for special treatment. The room filled slowly. Men and women in second-hand coats, some with tired eyes, others with nervous energy. A few carried resumes folded so many times they were soft at the edges. One young man sat in the back, fiddling with a pen, his shoes worn thin at the heel. The billionaire helped arrange tables, handed out folders. When someone dropped a stack of papers, he bent down and picked them up without being asked. At one point, during a break, he saw her. The woman from the courtroom, the one in the blue sweater, was sitting at a table near the window, helping another participant fill out a job application. She looked up, saw him, and didn't flinch, didn't glare, just gave a small, quiet nod. He walked over. "I didn't know you came here," he said, voice low. She looked at him for a long moment. "This place helped me after I lost my job," she said. "Now I volunteer." Pay it forward. He didn't know what to say, so he just stood there, awkward, out of place. After a while, she sighed. "You don't have to say sorry," she told him. "But you do have to see us. Really see us," he nodded. And for the first time, he did. Over the next few weeks, he came every Monday and Thursday. He didn't speak much, but he listened. He heard stories about choosing between rent and medicine, about working 3 jobs and still falling behind, about the shame of needing help, and the pride in trying anyway. One afternoon, the young man with the worn shoes stayed late. He was filling out an application for a warehouse job, the same kind of work the billionaire's company used to offer, but now with fair pay and benefits thanks to the court order. "Do you think they'll call me?" he asked quietly, looking up. The billionaire hesitated, then said, "If they don't, it's their loss." The young man smiled, a small, hopeful thing. That night, the billionaire sat in his quiet apartment, not his penthouse. He'd moved out after the ruling, said he needed space to think. On his desk was a folder from the court, his service log signed off week by week. And beside it, a note the woman in the blue sweater had slipped him that day. Thanks for showing up. That's where change starts. Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, the judge went about her days like always. She heard cases about property lines, custody disputes, small business contracts. No cameras, no fanfare. Just the steady work of justice, one case at a time. But people noticed. Law students started requesting clerkships in her court. Young public defenders quoted her rulings in their briefs. Even judges from other districts reached out, asking how she'd handled the case with such balance. Firm but fair, strong but never cruel. She never took credit. The law did the work, she'd say. I just held the door open. One afternoon, a retired school teacher stopped by the courthouse just to leave a thank you card at the clerk's desk. My grandson got his job back with full back pay, she wrote. He can finally breathe again. Thank you for remembering that people matter more than profits. The clerk slipped the card into the judge's inbox. She read it that evening, tucked it into the same drawer as the worker petition, and went home to make dinner for her grandkids. Months later, the company rolled out its new labor policies. Fair wages, clear contracts, a real grievance process. The changes weren't perfect, but they were real. And they came with a public statement not from a PR team, but from the top. We got it wrong. We're learning, and we're committed to doing better. No one expected it, but those who'd been hurt said it felt like a start. At the workforce center, the billionaire finished his 40 hours. On his last day, the director handed him a certificate. Not fancy, just plain paper with his name and the dates. He folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket. Before he left, the woman in the blue sweater walked over. You coming back? She asked. He looked around at the people laughing over coffee, at the job coach helping someone practice an interview, at the young man now wearing a uniform from his new job. Not because I have to, he said, but maybe because I want to, she smiled. Then you're already different. Back in court, the judge heard a new case that week, a small tech startup accused of similar labor violations. The owner was nervous, young, clearly out of his depth. When the judge asked questions, her tone was firm but kind. Have you spoken to your workers about their concerns? She asked. The young man swallowed. Not really. I thought I was saving money. She nodded. Saving money shouldn't cost someone their dignity. Let's figure out how to fix this before it gets this far. It wasn't punishment. It was guidance, and that's how her legacy grew. Not in headlines, but in quiet moments. In corrected course. In changed minds. Years later, when people talked about that courtroom showdown, they didn't remember the billionaire's arrogance or the gasps in the gallery. They remembered how the judge never raised her voice but never backed down. How she used the law not as a weapon but as a bridge, and how, in the end, respect wasn't demanded, it was earned, by standing for what's right. Even when no one's watching, the billionaire never became a hero, but he became human, and sometimes that's enough. The workers got their back pay. Some went back to school. Others started small businesses. One opened a childcare co-op for fellow single parents. Their lives weren't perfect, but they had breathing room, and that made all the difference. As for the judge, she kept showing up. Same robe, same calm voice, same belief that the courtroom should be a place where everyone, no matter their bank account or background, could walk in and be seen. One rainy afternoon, long after the case was closed, a young girl visited the courthouse with her class. She pointed to the bench and whispered to her teacher, "Is that where the judge who stood up for the workers sat?" The teacher smiled. "Yes, and she's still here." The girl nodded, eyes wide. "I want to be like her someday." And somewhere down the hall, the judge, reviewing a stack of files, felt a quiet warmth in her chest, not from praise, but from knowing the work would continue. Because justice isn't a single moment, it's a ripple, and sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to look away, and another finally learning how to see. There was never supposed to be a part 6. The story, by all accounts, had reached its natural end. Justice served. Lessons learned, lives changed. But sometimes real life doesn't wrap up neatly. Sometimes it circles back, not with drama, but with quiet echoes that remind us how deeply one moment can ripple through time. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning, nearly a year after the courtroom ruling. The judge was reviewing a routine motion in a housing dispute when her clerk slipped a letter onto her desk. plain envelope. No return address. Just her name typed neatly in the center. She opened it during her mid-morning break, expecting another thank you note or maybe a legal query from a student. But this was different. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The photo showed a small storefront in a neighborhood she recognized. Brick walls, a freshly painted sign that read, New Horizons Worker Co-op. In front stood a group of people, smiling. At the center was the woman in the blue sweater, her arm around the young man with the worn shoes. Behind them, shelves were stacked with cleaning supplies, uniforms, and scheduling boards labeled with names and shifts. The note beneath it was short. You gave us more than back pay. You gave us belief. We're running our own business now. Fair wages, shared decisions, no fear. We thought you should see what your courage helped build. Thank you for seeing us when no one else would. The judge read it twice. Then she tucked it into the same drawer as the petition and the schoolteacher's card. Not for show. Just to keep close. Later that day, she mentioned it to no one. But something in her step felt lighter. Meanwhile, across town, the billionaire sat in a modest office above a laundromat. No glass walls. No skyline view. Just a desk, a laptop, and a whiteboard covered in notes about ethical hiring practices. He'd stepped down as CEO months ago, not in disgrace but by choice. He'd taken a role advising startups on fair labor models, something he never would have considered before. He still visited the workforce center, now as a volunteer, not a court order. He helped review resumes, practiced interview questions with nervous job seekers, and once even drove a young mother to her first day at a new job when her car broke down. People didn't call him the billionaire anymore. They just called him by his first name. And he liked that. One afternoon, he got a call from the co-op. They needed someone to speak at their official opening, a short talk about second chances. He almost said no. But then he remembered the judge's words. Innovation should never come at the cost of human dignity. He said yes. The opening was held on a Saturday. A small crowd gathered. Neighbors, former co-workers, a few reporters who remembered the case. The woman in the blue sweater stood at the mic first. We were told we didn't matter, she said, voice steady. That we were replaceable. But today we own our work. We set our own rules. And we treat each other like family. Then she introduced him. He walked up slowly, no swagger, no rehearsed speech. Just a man holding a few notes scribbled on a napkin. I came here a year ago because a judge told me to. He began. But I stayed because you showed me what real work looks like. Not just hours logged, but dignity earned. I used to think success was measured in stock prices. Now I know it's measured in how many people can sleep at night because they're treated fairly. He didn't ask for applause, didn't seek forgiveness. He just spoke the truth, and that was enough. Afterward, as people mingled over coffee and pastries, the judge appeared at the edge of the room. She hadn't been invited. She'd heard about the event from a clerk whose cousin worked at the co-op. She didn't want to draw attention, just to see for herself. But the woman in the blue sweater spotted her right away. She walked over, eyes shining. You came. I wanted to see what hope looks like when it's put into action, the judge said softly. They stood together for a while, watching people laugh, plan, dream out loud. No cameras, no speeches, just community. Later, as the judge walked back to her car, a young boy, maybe 10 years old, ran up to her, holding a piece of paper. My mom works here now, he said, thrusting the paper toward her. She said you helped make this happen. I drew you a picture. It was a crayon sketch of a courtroom, but instead of a gavel, the judge was holding a ladder and people were climbing up it one by one. The judge knelt, took the drawing gently and looked him in the eye. Thank you, she said. This means more to me than you know. She kept the drawing on her office wall after that. Not in a frame, just taped to the corkboard beside her calendar, where she'd see it every day. Back at the courthouse, things had changed in subtle ways. Lawyers were more careful with how they spoke about workers in depositions. Companies began auditing their own labor practices before lawsuits even started. And in chambers, new judges asked for copies of her ruling, not to copy it, but to understand how fairness could be both firm and kind. One day, a law student asked her, "How did you stay so calm that day in court?" When he wouldn't stand? She thought for a moment. Because I wasn't fighting him, she said. I was holding space for everyone he'd tried to silence. Anger would have drowned their voices. Calm let them be heard. The student nodded, scribbling in her notebook. That same week, the co-op landed its first big contract, not with a tech giant, but with a local school district. Fair pay, full benefits, and a clause that said if any worker felt mistreated, they could bring it directly to management. No fear, no retaliation. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And real change, the judge knew, never happens overnight. It happens in laundry rooms turned into offices, in hand-drawn pictures, in quiet apologies that aren't spoken but lived. Months later, on the anniversary of the ruling, the billionaire sent a letter, not to the judge, but to the court clerk. Tell her I finally understand. Justice isn't about winning. It's about making sure everyone gets to stand tall, including those who once forgot how. The clerk read it, smiled, and placed it in the judge's inbox without comment. The judge read it that evening. She didn't respond. She didn't need to, because the best replies aren't written in letters. They're written in lives rebuilt, in dignity restored, in courtrooms where everyone rises, not because they're told to, but because they finally understand why it matters. And in the end, that's the only shock the world really needs, the quiet, steady truth that respect, fairness, and courage can change everything, not with a bang, but with 1,000 small acts of seeing, listening, and standing together.